The meeting had already started by the time Daniel Walsh understood what she had done. She was standing in the hallway outside the main conference room with a stack of project binders she had been asked to deliver 10 minutes earlier, and through the narrow vertical window beside the door, she could see the faces arranged around the table, the overhead projector throwing blue light across the wall, and at the head of the table, a man she recognized. She recognized him because she had given him a visitor badge 3 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning when nobody had thought to introduce him to anyone. She recognized him because he had thanked her for it in a way that people who are accustomed to receiving small courtesies do not usually thank anyone. She recognized him because he had left something on her desk 4 days ago, a single page in a plain envelope, and she had only understood what it was this morning when she finally looked up the name printed at the bottom. The binders were getting heavy. She shifted them against her hip and watched through the window as Sylvia Crane pulled out the chair beside her and said something to the man at the head of the table, and he looked past her, directly at the glass panel in the door, directly at Daniel, and said something that made Sylvia turn. Daniel did not move. There was nowhere to go. She had arrived at Crane Aldrich Architecture on a Monday morning in the second week of October, 3 weeks before the moment at the conference room door, with a paper badge from the staffing agency clipped to her coat and a printed confirmation of a 6-week temp assignment in her bag. The firm occupied the 5th through 7th floors of a building on Grant Street, and the lobby had the kind of deliberate quiet that firms maintain when they want to suggest that their work is too considered for noise. Pale concrete floors, a reception desk in pale oak, a wall of framed renderings behind the desk, each one illuminated by a small lamp mounted above the frame. The reception desk clerk, a young man named Brent who wore his lanyard twisted so that his name faced inward, told her to take the stairs to the 6th floor and ask for the office manager. The office manager was a woman named Lena who had the particular efficiency of someone running a system that was slightly understaffed and had accepted that fact. Lena walked her to the records room on the 6th floor's north wing, explained the filing system in approximately 4 minutes, handed her a laminated reference card, and said the temp from the agency before her had filed 2 entire drawers of project documents under the wrong numerical prefix, which was why Daniel was here. The records room was a room that no one visited unless they needed something from it. That was immediately apparent. The overhead light was on a motion sensor, and if Daniel stood still long enough to concentrate on a drawer's contents, the sensor would time out and leave her in the dark. She learned in the first hour to keep 1 foot moving. The work itself was not uninteresting. Each project file was organized around a numerical code that corresponded to a project phase and a client. And once Daniel understood the logic of the coding, the misfiled documents stopped being a random pile of paper and became a comprehensible history of the firm's last 8 years. There were hand-drawn site plans and printed CAD elevations and land surveys with handwritten margin notes. There were photographs of completed buildings, images of early models, correspondence between architects and municipal planning offices in 3 different cities. The firm was small enough that its history was all here in physical form, and the history was genuinely worth reading. She did not tell anyone she found it worth reading. She filed what needed filing and returned the room to its original order and kept her foot moving so the light stayed on. Sylvia Crane appeared on her second day. Sylvia was the senior partner whose name appeared on approximately half the framed renderings in the lobby. She was probably in her mid-50s, dressed in the particular way of someone whose clothes announce that their time has value. She stood in the doorway of the records room for a moment, took in the progress Daniel had made on the misfiled drawers, and said, without specific greeting, "The coding on the Meridian cluster is going to need to be reformatted before the end of the month. Ask Lena what that means." She was already turning back toward the corridor before she finished the sentence. Daniel asked Lena. Lena explained that the Meridian Cluster was a set of projects from roughly 6 years back that had been recoded when the firm restructured its client billing system, and the physical files still reflected the old codes, while the digital records used the new ones. Someone needed to go through the physical files and attach cross-reference slips, so both systems pointed to the same place. It was a task that required careful attention and no particular architectural knowledge, which was why it had been assigned to the temp. "It's clerical," Lena said, not unkindly. "Just methodical. You'll be fine." Daniel nodded and went back to the records room and started pulling the Meridian files. The first exchange with the man who called himself Marcus happened on a Thursday morning in the middle of Daniel's first week. He appeared in the 6th-floor lobby area at approximately 10 in the morning, carrying a soft-sided leather briefcase and wearing a dark wool coat that he had not yet taken off, which meant he had come directly from outside. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that was easy to read as composed rather than closed, and he was looking at the building directory on the wall beside the elevator, with the attentiveness of someone who had never needed to read it before and found it mildly interesting now. Daniel was passing through the lobby with a trolley of rolled drawings. She needed to return to the 4th-floor map cabinet. She stopped the trolley. "Do you need a visitor badge?" she said. "Ha." He looked at the directory for another moment, then at her. "I should probably get one of those. Yes." She walked him to the small cabinet beside the reception cluster where the visitor badges were kept, filled in the paper log with the date and time, and handed him a laminated badge on a clip. "Third door on the left is the main conference room," she said. "If you're looking for the partners' offices, those are on 7. You'd take the interior staircase, not the elevator." "Which is faster?" he said. "Stairs if you know where they are. Elevator if you don't want to get lost." He clipped the badge to his coat pocket without looking down at it. "I'll take the elevator," he said, and then, as she was already turning back to her trolley, "Thank you." She acknowledged it with a small nod and got her trolley moving again. The rolled drawings rattled softly against each other as she went. She did not think about him again until the following Monday, when she found him in the records room. He had not opened anything. He was standing near the long center table with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the row of open drawers Daniel had left partially sorted when she went to retrieve the reference card she'd left at Lena's desk. The overhead light was still on, which meant he hadn't been there long. "I'm sorry," Daniel said from the doorway, because she was instinctively apologizing for the disorder, even though the disorder was the result of her work in progress and not a failure. "I was reorganizing the Meridian Cluster. It looks worse than it is." "Meridian," he said, and she noticed that he did not say it the way people say a word they are confirming, but the way they say a word they have not heard out loud in some time. "How long does a project like that take to sort?" "At the pace I'm going, probably another week. The cross-referencing is more complicated than the physical filing." He looked at the open drawer again. "What makes it complicated?" She came into the room and stood at the other end of the table, because the conversations seemed to be continuing, and it was easier to talk with the cabinet between them than from the doorway. "The old codes and the new codes don't follow the same logic. The old system organized by project phase first, then by client. The new system flips it. So when I cross-reference, I have to verify the project identity from the actual file contents. Rather than just reading the code, it means opening a lot of folders." He listened to this with an attentiveness she would not have expected from a visitor who presumably had somewhere to be. "Are you the one who noticed the logic difference, or did someone explain it to you?" "I worked it out from the files," she said. A brief pause. "That's useful," he said with the flatness of someone who means exactly that and nothing decorative beyond it. He left a few minutes later. She stayed for another hour, and after she closed the last drawer, she thought briefly that the conversation had been one of the more straightforward ones she had had in 3 weeks. And then she went to retrieve the trolley and thought about it no more. Patrice Owens worked 3 offices down from the records room and drafted construction documents on a large monitor she had positioned at an angle that made it difficult for people passing the door to see what she was doing. She had been at the firm for 6 years. She brought her lunch in a blue insulated bag and ate it at her desk, with the door mostly closed, which Daniel had initially read as preference for solitude, and later understood was preference for avoiding the main kitchen, where Sylvia occasionally held court. Patrice had knocked on the records room door at the end of Daniel's first week and said simply, "I'm the one whose files you're saving from oblivion. I owe you a coffee." The coffee had been from the machine in the secondary kitchen on the 6th floor's south end, and it was better than what Daniel made at home, and Patrice had stood with her cup and said, "I heard Sylvia assigned you the Meridian cross-referencing. That's not really a temp task. That's a task they've been putting off for 2 years because nobody here wants to do it." "I don't mind it," Daniel said. Patrice looked at her with the directness of someone who has decided a person is worth their attention. "You also fixed the misfiled drawers in 4 days. Brent told me. Brent tells me everything." The previous agency person had filed everything from 2019 under the prefix for 2016, Daniel said. "It wasn't hard to spot." "No," Patrice said, "but it was hard to fix. That's different." They drank their coffee. Patrice told her something about the firm's current projects that was not confidential, and not a complaint, but simply informational, the way someone tells you about a place after they've lived there long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. The main partner, Sylvia, handled business development and client relationships. Her co-partner, a man named Aldrich, who had left 2 years ago when the firm bought out his stake, had been the design lead. Since Aldrich left, the firm had been in a transition that nobody described out loud as a transition, but that everyone felt in the slightly elevated speed of meetings and the slightly more frequent visits from people with briefcases. "Is it going to be sold?" Daniel asked. "I genuinely don't know," Patrice said. "Nobody tells me anything official. I just see who comes through." Daniel thought of the man in the dark coat who had asked her about the records room cross-referencing with the attentiveness of someone who was listening for something specific. She did not say this out loud. The second time Marcus appeared in the records room was on a Wednesday, and this time he came with a specific question. He knocked, which no one else ever did. She called him in, and he came to the center table and set his briefcase beside it. And he said, "The Aldgate project files from 2018 and 2019. Would those be in this room or in off-site storage?" She knew the answer because she had seen the Aldgate files during her first week reorganization. "They're here. I can pull them." She found the relevant section in the 4th drawer of the East cabinet and brought out 4 hanging folders. He thanked her, sat down at the center table and began reading. She went back to the Meridian cross-referencing at the opposite end of the table. They worked in silence for approximately 20 minutes, which was not an uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of a shared space rather than a forced one. He closed the Aldgate folder eventually and held it with both hands flat on the cover, the way you hold something when you are deciding what you have just learned from it. "Were you the one who organized these?" he said. "The order within the folder? No, that was already there. I just made sure they were in the right cabinet location." "The order within the folder is very good," he said. He was not saying it to compliment her. He was saying it the way you report an observation. "One of your architects must have organized them originally," she said. "Yes," he said. He was careful. He returned the folder to her and picked up his briefcase. At the door he paused, half-turned. "What's your name?" "Daniel Walsh." "Marcus," he said, and that was the full introduction on both sides. 2 names and no titles, and he left. She sat for a moment after the door fell shut, and then she picked up the Meridian folder she had been working on and resumed the cross-referencing. But she noticed that the room felt slightly different after he left. the way a room does when it has been briefly used by someone who actually pays attention to things. Sylvia called Daniel to the 7th floor at the end of the following week. The 7th floor was different from the 6th in the particular way that partner offices are different from working floors. The carpet was thicker. The light came from fixtures rather than tubes. The views from the north windows extended across the river to the far bank, and someone had positioned a drafting table near those windows that was covered in preliminary sketches and appeared to be used with some regularity. Sylvia's office was at the east corner. She was standing at her desk when Daniel came in, which meant she did not intend the meeting to take long. "The meridian cross-referencing," Sylvia said. "Where are you on it?" "About 2/3 through. I should finish by the end of next week." "Good. When you finish, I need you to format the project code references for the client summary report. Lena will give you the template." She set the page down. "You've been doing well with the filing work. It's useful." The sentence landed as it was meant to, which was as a judgment about the category of work rather than about Daniel personally. Useful filing. A function performed adequately. Sylvia was not cruel in the way that requires effort. She was simply accurate about what she considered worth noticing, and equally accurate about what she did not. "I'll have the meridian work done by Friday," Daniel said. "That's fine." Sylvia looked at her desk. The meeting was over. Daniel walked back to the stairs and went down to the 6th floor and went back to the records room. She kept her foot moving. The light stayed on. It was on a Thursday afternoon with about 4 days left in the cross-referencing that Daniel heard what she was not supposed to hear. The records room shared a ventilation duct with a small conference room 2 doors down the hall. She had known this in the abstract way you know things about a building you work in, which is to say she had occasionally heard fragments of meetings, too muffled to pass, and had ignored them. On Thursday afternoon, the conference room door must have been left open because the ventilation duct gave her not a muffled fragment, but a clear and specific sentence, delivered in Sylvia's voice, in the slightly elevated tone Sylvia used when she was speaking to someone she considered a peer. "The temp is perfectly functional, but I need you to understand that the reference letter she asked for will do exactly what a reference letter needs to do to keep us compliant. It will say she completed her assignment, that the work was satisfactory, and that we wish her well. Nothing that obliges us to anything further." A pause. The other voice was lower. Daniel could not catch it. "She found a misfiled drawer," Sylvia said. "That's not a credential. That's just someone reading a code correctly." The overhead light timed out. Daniel stood in the dark with the folder in her hands and did not move for a moment longer than she needed to. She moved her foot. The light came back. She had asked Lena about the reference letter 2 weeks into the assignment, because the staffing agency had told her to request one if the work extended past the midpoint, and the assignment was going well. Lena had passed the request to Sylvia, which was protocol, and Sylvia had apparently agreed, and Daniel had not thought further about it. She had imagined the letter would be adequate. She had not imagined it would be deliberate in its adequacy, calculated to provide cover without providing anything that could be used. She returned the folder to the drawer. She closed the drawer with both hands flat on its front, the way you close something when you want to close it evenly rather than hard. She went back to the cross-referencing. She still had 4 days of work left. She finished it in 3. The meridian cross-referencing was, in the end, more complete than anyone had asked for. The task as assigned had been to attach the cross-reference slips and note the new code equivalents. Daniel did that. She also went through the files for the dozen projects adjacent to the Meridian cluster that used the same billing system changeover, because once she understood the logic, stopping at the formal boundary of the assignment seemed arbitrary. She noted every inconsistency, organized the notation system so that the same reader who was comfortable with the new code could navigate the old one in either direction, and wrote a half-page summary of the cross-referencing structure that anyone unfamiliar with it could use to continue the work or audit it later. She left the summary at the front of the first Meridian file and did not mention it to Sylvia or Lena. No one saw her do any of this. She was finishing the last of the client summary template reformatting on the following Monday when she found the envelope. It was sitting in the center of the table, which was the place people left things when they did not know where else to put them, the neutral surface in a room with no clear owner. It had her name on it, printed in a clear hand. Daniel Walsh, no address, no firm name in the return corner. She opened it. Inside was a single page on plain paper, not firm letterhead, and it was a reference letter. It began with the date and her name and the brief statement that the writer had had the opportunity to observe her work during a portion of her assignment at the firm. It described, in 3 paragraphs of specific and unhurried prose, the nature of the cross-referencing task and the quality of the work she had produced, noting in particular that she had extended the scope of the task beyond the original assignment, because the logic of the work required it, and that she had produced a navigational summary without being asked that would serve the firm's records integrity for years. It noted that she had answered a technical question accurately, and without referring to a resource when a more experienced person might have guessed, and a less careful person might have invented an answer. It noted that she was the kind of person who made systems work without requiring the system to notice her. The final paragraph was 3 sentences. It said that the writer was prepared to speak to any of this directly, that the writer's contact information was below, and that any employer who was in a position to offer Daniel Walsh work that used what she was actually capable of would be making a sound decision. It was signed. The signature was a clean, upright cursive, the kind of signature a person develops when they sign a large number of documents and have decided that legibility is a form of respect. Below it, printed in block capitals, was a name and a title. The name was Marcus Hale. The title was Owner and Principal, Hale Development Group, LLC. She did not know what Hale Development Group, LLC was. She read the name twice and understood that it was not the same name as any partner at Crane Aldrich. She sat with the page in her hands for a long moment, the way you sit with something when you know it means something but you haven't yet located the meaning. She set the page back in the envelope. She went back to the template reformatting and finished it by the end of the afternoon. She did not look up the name that evening. She was not sure exactly why she didn't. Perhaps she was tired in a specific way that had nothing to do with the day's work and everything to do with what she had heard through the ventilation duct, and looking something up felt like she was trying to make the letter into something it might not be. She let it sit. She looked it up on the 3rd day, which was a Thursday morning before she left for work. She typed the name into the search bar with her coffee going cold beside her keyboard, and the results came back in under 2 seconds. Hale Development Group, LLC, was not a small firm. It was not an obscure firm. It was a development and design holding company with offices in 4 cities that had, among other things, acquired 3 mid-sized architectural practices in the past decade. And its portfolio page showed buildings in shapes that were nothing like the standard commercial glass rectangles, but had the particular restrained confidence of design that doesn't need to announce itself. She looked at the photographs for a moment. Then she scrolled to the founder's page. Marcus Hale. A photograph. The man in the dark coat. She sat with her cold coffee and the screen and the particular sensation of a room reorganizing itself around you without moving. She read the reference letter again from the envelope. She read it in the specific context of now knowing who had written it. and every sentence changed slightly in register, the way a piece of music changes when you learn it was written for a specific occasion. He had not been a visitor passing through on routine business. He had been in the records room for reasons she had not guessed, looking at files she had already reorganized, reading work she had done before he arrived. He had asked her about the cross-referencing logic, not because he was making conversation, but because he was genuinely asking. She thought of the Aldgate files she had pulled for him. She thought of the way he held the folder with his hands, flat on the cover. She put the letter back in the envelope and picked up her bag and went to work. The board meeting was on Friday. She had not known about it until Thursday afternoon, when Lena sent an all-staff message asking the 6th floor team to have the relevant project files ready by 9 in the morning and available for collection. The list of files attached to the message included the Meridian cluster files, the Aldgate files, and the client summary report Daniel had just finished formatting. She spent Thursday afternoon pulling everything on the list and organizing it on the center table with labeled tabs so that whoever came to collect them would not have to sort. She was carrying the first stack of binders from the records room to the 7th floor conference area the following morning, when Patrice appeared beside her in the corridor, carrying her own load of printed construction sheets. "Do you know who's in the meeting?" Patrice said, quiet enough for a corridor. "No," Daniel said. "Brent says it's an acquisition discussion." Patrice kept her voice level, but her eyes were slightly brighter than usual. "Brent says whoever they're talking to already had access to the physical files." Daniel looked ahead at the end of the corridor. "When did they get access to the files?" "Brent says the request came through about 2 weeks ago, the records room." Patrice paused for a step. "You were in the records room 2 weeks ago." "Yes," Daniel said. Patrice looked at her with the expression of someone who has just placed the last piece of a pattern she's been building for a while. She didn't say anything else. They delivered the files to the 7th floor and came back down separately. Daniel returned to the records room. She had one remaining task from the template work, a minor correction to the project code index, and she sat at the center table and worked on it, listening to the building settle into its morning rhythm around her. She could hear the elevator. She could hear the movement above her on 7. At about 9:45, she picked up the last binder on the list that she had not yet delivered and walked to the 7th floor. The meeting had already started. She stood in the corridor with the binders against her hip and looked through the glass panel at the room. There were 6 people around the table, and Sylvia was among them, and the man at the head of the table was Marcus. He was not in the dark coat today. He was in a jacket and a shirt open at the collar, and he was speaking with the contained, unhurried precision of someone who does not need the room's attention because the room's attention is already his. She watched him for a moment. He was not looking at the door. She was about to turn back toward the stairs when the door opened from the inside. One of the people at the table, a younger man she had not seen before, had presumably noticed her through the glass and come to take the binders. She handed them over. The man nodded and began to pull the door shut. Marcus spoke from the head of the table. "Would you ask Daniel to wait?" The younger man paused. Sylvia turned. Daniel, through the narrowing gap of the closing door, stayed exactly where she was. The door opened again, fully this time, and the younger man looked at her with the slight uncertainty of someone executing a request he had not anticipated. "He says, could you wait for a moment?" She waited. The door did not fully close again. From where she stood, she could hear the rhythm of the meeting rather than its content, the pace of an exchange that was winding toward a conclusion. After approximately 7 minutes, chairs shifted and papers moved in the particular percussion of a meeting that has reached its end without requiring a formal announcement of that fact. The door opened fully. The 6 people at the table were standing and gathering their things, and Marcus was at the near end now, and Sylvia was to his left, and she was wearing an expression that was not quite any of the expressions Daniel had seen on her before. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. Not alarmed, not apologetic, simply recalibrating the slight interior adjustment of a person who has just learned that a wall they believe to be exterior is, in fact, a partition. Marcus stepped into the corridor and looked at Daniel directly. "Thank you for pulling all of these," he said, and gestured at the room, which was laid out with the files she had organized. The Meridian summary was particularly useful. Sylvia was 3 feet away. "I'm glad it helped," Daniel said. "I expected it to be basic cross-referencing," Marcus said. "What you put together was considerably more than that. The navigational structure is clean. The notation system is consistent." He said it the way he said everything, in flat declarative sentences whose authority came from the fact that they were simply reporting what was there. "I mentioned that in the reference." Sylvia did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't aware you had written a reference." "I left it on Monday," Marcus said. He did not look at Sylvia when he said it. He was still looking at Daniel. "It was very specific," Daniel said, because it had been, and because she had read it twice and knew. "It was accurate," he said. There was a pause in the corridor of perhaps 5 seconds that felt considerably longer, the particular silence of a conversation that has said something in the hearing of someone it was not addressed to, and that person is aware of it. Patrice was still at the far end of the corridor. She had not moved. Brent had appeared at the edge of the stairwell door, the way Brent appeared at most things, as an observer. Sylvia said with the careful steadiness of someone applying deliberate pressure to each word. "Mr. Hale, I wasn't aware you had taken such an interest in the temp assignment." Marcus looked at her then. "I take an interest in the work," he said. "The work was here." The sentence landed in the corridor and stayed. Sylvia's expression did not fragment. She was too practiced for that. What happened was something smaller and, in its way, more total. She looked at Daniel once with the precise expression of someone who has just understood that an assessment they made and acted upon is now a matter of record in a way they had not anticipated, and that there is nothing to be done about the record. She did not say anything else. She turned back toward the conference room and began to speak to one of the other people from the meeting, a man with a portfolio tucked under his arm, and her voice returned to its usual register, professional and calibrated. But the conversation with that man was the kind of conversation you have when you need to be doing something in a corridor that you cannot simply leave. Daniel understood this and did not watch it. Marcus said, more quietly, "How much time is left on your assignment?" 2 weeks, she said. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a business card, which he held out to her. "When you're finished here, if you want to have a conversation about what's next, that would be worth doing." She took the card. It was heavier than standard stock, which was the only outward indicator she had received that afternoon of how seriously to read the offer. "I'll call," she said. "Good," he said. He went back into the conference room to retrieve his briefcase and his coat. The other meeting participants filed past Daniel in ones and twos, none of them people she knew. Patrice appeared beside her when the last of them had gone. "That was," Patrice said, and then stopped, because there wasn't a word for it that wouldn't reduce it. "Yes," Daniel said. "Are you all right?" Daniel considered the question, which was a genuine question and deserved a genuine answer. "I think so," she said. "I think I've been all right for a while. It just took some time to become legible." Patrice looked at her with the expression of someone who has been a loyal observer of a situation and is now watching it resolve in the specific way they had hoped and not quite believed it would. She didn't say anything else. She put her hand briefly on Daniel's arm and then took it back and turned toward her office and walked. Daniel spent the remainder of the day finishing the last small task on the client summary index, the minor code correction she had been working on when she picked up the binders to carry upstairs. It took under an hour. When it was done, she returned the completed work to the front of the relevant file, the way she had returned everything, without announcement, and set the file in its drawer. She pulled on her coat at 5:30 and stood for a moment in the records room with the lights still on, the drawers all closed, the long center table empty and clean. 2 weeks remained of the 6-week assignment, and there was still real work to do. Lena had mentioned a backlog of site visit correspondence that needed to be sorted and filed before the end of the month, and the off-site storage index needed to be reconciled against the current room inventory. She had looked at both tasks already and had a clear idea of how to approach them. She had been coming into this room every weekday for 3 weeks. The motion sensor overhead had timed out on her every afternoon, and every afternoon she had moved her foot and brought the light back, and the room had been, for those weeks, a place that needed someone to be careful in it, and she had been careful. The business card was in the outer pocket of her bag, next to the envelope with the reference letter. She had put them together, not intentionally, but they had ended up in the same place, which seemed right. She would call on Monday from somewhere quiet, and she would speak plainly about what she could do, because that was the conversation he had said was worth having, and she believed him. She turned off the overhead light manually, using the switch beside the door, which was something she had never done before, because the motion sensor had always caught her leaving. Tonight, she was standing still on purpose. The room went dark behind her. She pulled the door shut and heard the latch click and went down the stairs and out the front door onto Grant Street, where the evening light was flat and cool and October thin, and the building behind her held, somewhere in a drawer on the 6th floor, 3 weeks of careful work that would serve whoever came after her without requiring her name on any of it. She walked toward the bus stop, her coat buttoned against the wind, with the business card in her pocket, and the particular lightness of someone who has just discovered that being careful in an empty room is not the same as being invisible.